Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and we've just come out of a presidential election, and politics is on everybody's mind, even if they're sort of trying to forget politics. But we're going to go back into the late 18th century, even into the early 19th century, and we're going to talk about a political fraction known as the Essex Junto. And Chris, um, I know when we both started looking into this particular topic, we both found that this was, not an easy research topic here.
It's true that history you didn't know. A lot of people just are not familiar with it. But when you selected it and you started kind of going back and looking at the context, there are some parallels into today's society and some of the things that are going on. Because what you see is that there was an extreme group of individuals who had strong views of how the government should be, and wanted to protect their rights. And so I think there is a lot of discussion through what we're talking about today that refers to state rights versus federal rights, and what kind of control can or should the ones in Washington D.C. have. So I think maybe as we dive into this, that individuals will see why it's important, because it demonstrates the beauty of a republic, the importance of democracy, but also the opportunity each person has to practice free speech and to be opinionated about their specific interest and to join in a collective group of people that support those same views as well.
Absolutely. I like that idea, the collected group. You have these groups of people that sort of come together to push various political agendas. And I think that certainly uh, well describes the Essex Junto. So, Chris, do you know where this group got its name, Essex Junto?
I do not. All that I know is that junto is refers to faction. That's
Yeah,
kind of the word faction.
yeah.
Essex, I think, is the location.
Yeah, it was a county in Massachusetts. I guess it probably still is a county in Massachusetts. And that's where the original group was from, the original sort of movers and shakers that became known as the Essex Junto. And like a lot of labels that are given to groups, the Essex Junto was originally coined sort of as an insult, I guess, because you got to remember that at, late 18th century, political parties were largely frowned upon. Anybody who's read Washington's farewell address is very familiar with his warnings about party and the dangers of party. So the idea of political parties was something a lot of the founders and people in that era sort of looked down upon, they didn't like. So calling this group the Essex Junto, sort of this political faction, these people driven by politics, was certainly not a compliment. It wasn't something that these people would have prized.
Right. And I mean, the other aspect is, there are not just one particular faction, but there's multiple factions that are going on. And there's also this War of 1812 that is taking place during this time. And, these individuals in Massachusetts were wealthy merchants and also politicians. And they're just concerned, rightly so. Here we are with another war,
Mhm.
and we just got ourselves established. We've just finished, dealing with war, and we're trying to rebuild. Here's war again. And they are afraid about the impact that the War of 1812 is going to have on their respective interests, especially economics. And so, they kind of get this little spurt saying, you know what, look at who we are. We're from Essex County in Massachusetts, and, we are somebody. And they basically will say, listen, you're going to do what we say. And if you don't do what we say, fine, we will secede from the Union. And all that does is contribute to growing tensions among other states and among other people, which ultimately, of course, our listeners are thinking War of 1812, okay, Civil War is 1865. So you'll start to see that, as shows that divisional rivalries of factions of Massachusetts, the New England, but then the middle colonies and the southern colonies, but also pushing out towards the west. And then you have the issues concerning slave and non-slave. And so I really think this small little blip on the radar actually pushes forward this rise in statewide divisiveness.
Yeah, statewide divisiveness and regional divisiveness. And I think it's important to note that these people were Federalists. And Federalists, early on, we really had two political parties develop. And these political parties were not political parties as we think of them today. We think of political parties today, the way they sort of formed following the Jackson and Van Buren era. These well-funded machines that, have conventions and all of this stuff. A lot of these two political parties that we're going to, really be talking about here, are parties more in the sense that they're juntos. They're more in the sense that they are groups of people who think, well, I sort of think this way, so I'm a Federalist. I think this way, so I'm a Jeffersonian, or what some historians refer to as Republicans or Democratic Republicans. So you have these sort of two political parties that really take shape during Washington's years in the White House. And this group known as the Essex Junto was part of that Federalist movement. And like Chris said, like you said, these are people based out of Massachusetts. These were people based out of New England. And they looked around and they looked at the South gaining more power. You think about the administration of Thomas Jefferson. They looked at the West, westward expansion, and they didn't like what they saw. And this whole movement was really about maintaining the power and the influence of New England in the face of a changing and growing nation. And then, of course, you have the War of 1812, which they opposed, I think partly, or if not totally, because they supported, as Federalists, like most Federalists, they supported friendship with Great Britain and trade with Great Britain, and they thought a war against Great Britain by James Madison, who was a Democratic Republican, would be harmful to their region and their states.
And so you look at this, and we pause at that moment, and then we kind of look at it in today's society. So the first thing is you have a group of people that have extreme strength. Well, right now in our society, we have Republicans who are extremist Republicans. We have Democrats who are extremist Democrats. And basically what that means is we have our party loyalty, but it is way, way to the other side on the spectrum. And to the point where back then this group said, listen, if we don't get what we want, and if you're not going to protect us, then we'll just leave you.
Yeah.
Well, throughout history, we will see this mentality come along. I remember Texas. Texas basically said, you know what, we'll go and claim our own independence. We'll be our own nation. We don't need you. And Ray, even just recently, I don't know her name and I don't pay much attention to it, but some lady and government in California has submitted a bill to the California legislature that says, due to the events of the recent presidential election, I feel that it's necessary for California to secede from the Union and to be its own independent country. So what you're seeing is, in part, people taking the ideas of what the Essex Junto did and applying it into modern day. You have this extremist view, hey, we didn't get what we want, so we'll head on out. And what really ticks off people, especially back in the Essex Junto time, is that they go, just going off about what's taking place in the War of 1812 because of the trade issues. But Ray, the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to talk negatively about the military and about the successes of the war when you're winning. Because when you're winning, everybody starts to see that nationalism, you have that power, you start to feel good. And so they actually start to look bad because what's happening is here they are complaining and whining and griping, but America's winning. And so then you become unpatriotic. You become, the enemy. And I think there was, and elaborate on it, this convention that takes place. I think it was known as the Hartford Convention, and that's really where the wheels on this movement start to fall off the track.
Yeah, the Battle of New Orleans, of course, who's the great victor of New Orleans? None other than Andrew
Jackson.
Jackson himself. This big win there. I was going to say at the end of the war, but technically the war had already ended. Word just hadn't reached New Orleans and Andrew Jackson yet. But America, like you said, America sort of comes out of the War of 1812 with this big victory down at New Orleans, and the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, and the country's starting to sort of feel good about itself. And here's this group of people that in 1814 got together at Hartford, Connecticut, and had this Hartford Convention, basically saying, you know what, we didn't get our way, so we're going to take our marbles and we're going to, go home and, not play nice with anybody. And I found it very interesting. You were talking about the lady out in California who has proposed secession because of the election of Donald Trump. Of course, it wouldn't be the first time in American history that a presidential election has led to talk about potential secession. I know in 1801, when there was the controversy over Jefferson becoming president, of course, he and Burr tied in the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives had to resolve that issue. Um, but there were people in New England, and I'm sure they were connected to the Essex Junto, who said, well, we would rather secede than have Thomas Jefferson as our president. And then, of course, in 1860, you have the South, Southern states starting to secede just 2 months after Abraham Lincoln was the winner of the 1860 presidential election. So I guess America has a long history to some degree of, well, we don't get our way, so we're gonna leave.
But it really comes back to economics. It comes back to money because this whole thing is centered around money. They truly believed that all that was going on right now was going to cause them to lose money. It was going to cause them to lose. And if you didn't have money, you didn't have power. And if you didn't have power, you didn't have control over your particular area. And so they began to be concerned. And, this basically will foreshadow future regional conflicts because it, once again, it emphasizes the me ideology versus the we ideology. Instead of the United States of America, it becomes, Massachusetts against everybody else. And not even Massachusetts, but even Essex County of Massachusetts, which had different viewpoints than, say, Boston or, somewhere else in New England in the colonies. So this political system basically wanted a strong central government that allowed states some degree of autonomy. We're the same way today, in essence. We have a federal government, but we prefer that it is mostly control goes down on a state level or a local level. There is a lot of conflict between federal government and state government and the concept of, once again, economic resources and finances. You have, individuals saying, we're going to freeze this amount of money on a federal level, and then states are basically saying, well, wait a second, if you do that, we don't have money to be able to fund the various needs of, say, education or healthcare or nutrition. And so there's this still squabble between, states and federal, which are leading to regional differences, because North Carolina is might struggle a little bit more than, say, a wealthier state, because it's more rural, and so there's more need base in this area, say, than in, a state of California or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's amazing when you think about something like the Essex Junto in, you know, late 18th, early 19th century, how it's the issues and stuff that drove that are still very much here today. One of the things I always tell students, whether it's in American history or American government, and sometimes I let students, especially in my online classes, Chris, I let students sort of come to this point by themselves. I don't tell them. And that is that the fight between big federal government, powerful state government, that fight has been with us from the beginning, and it's still with us to this very day. The people have changed, the specific issues may have changed, but the general fight over who should be more powerful, the states or the feds, it's with us even today. And like you mentioned, the Trump administration's recent freeze of federal funding. And I mean, what was the turnaround time before the Office of Management and Budget reversed it? It was like, what, 48 hours,
Less
maybe?
than that, yeah.
It was quick. And it was quick because states, and I'm sure congressmen and senators as well, were getting on the phone and calling the White House saying, no, you can't do this because this is undermining the states, you know. And so these type of issues are still very much with us today.
Right. And what I think that you still see is, and I think it's okay to have different ideologies. It's okay to have different opinions. The problem comes when we don't respect each other's opinions.
Right.
And I think we're experiencing some of that here in our study of the Essex Junto today, but also just in society, that we have this idea that what we think is right and that there's no other way for anybody else to be right. And the reality is that everybody's got good ideas that we present is for the greater good of the whole and not just a part. And that is where Essex Junto kind of failed, because it wasn't for the greater good of the whole. When the wars was turning the tides for success, that's when Essex should have said, "Oh, we need to back down on this a little bit. We need to recognize that, okay, it's going to be all right. We can work together with the federal government. We can work together with other state governments, and we can all be successful." But instead, they stuck to their roots, and you start to see this debate that keeps going all across the United States. It leads to some bloody battles, Missouri Compromise. You have all of these other things that happen, and ultimately you'll see the Civil War, which divides the nation, which then leads to trying to restore that through civil rights, but then that gets divided as well. So it's just a constant wheel that turns.
Yeah, that wheel is forever turning. And going back just real quickly before we wrap up here, um, the Essex Junto and their approach following the War of 1812 killed the Federalist Party. If you think about it, Federalists only had two presidents, George Washington and John Adams. And the Federalist Party, after John Adams with two terms of Jefferson, two terms of Madison, the the Federalist Party, sort of slowly died out, and the Essex Junto died out as well. And like you said, they just weren't where everybody else was. Because I think, Chris, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I think America over time was more on the side of Jefferson and Madison than it was on Hamilton and Adams, even though Hamilton and Adams didn't like each other. They were both more on that Federalist side. But I think America itself sort of came down more on the side of Jefferson and Madison.
Because Jefferson was for the people.
Right.
And that ultimately is what, I remember Jefferson walking to take the oath of office. He walked in traditional clothes.
Yeah.
He walked. He wanted to be a president for the people, which you start seeing that later with Andrew Jackson. Once again, be for the people, and then even today, the stuff that that the current president is doing. He says, "I have been mandated by the people. The people have chosen me to do these things." The problem comes just with Jefferson, Jackson, and even Trump, that sometimes the mandate is misunderstood. And instead of working for the people, you start to see you work for the ideology instead of what's best for the people. I'm not saying that they do that maliciously, just saying that it's easy to lose sight of what the ultimate goal is. I think it happened in Essex. I think in some parts it still happens today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good observation there. That's a really good observation that sometimes these parties, these politicians maybe misread the tea leaves a little bit. I think that's a really good observation. Well, Chris, great episode. I'm sorry for throwing the curveball on the topic a little bit here. The Essex Junto, only I would come up with a topic like that. But I find this stuff just endlessly fascinating. So anyway, hope our listeners enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We do ask you, share this episode with your family and friends. Go back in our catalog of episodes, whether it's on Spotify, on Anchor, on YouTube. Listen to those older episodes, share those episodes. Find us on Facebook, and like us on Facebook and like episodes on these various platforms. We would greatly appreciate it. Help to get the podcast a little bit more in the way of attention. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.